I think these things tend to, you know, the great rush of people tends to come in at about 5 past. Still, everybody's foostering, finding their links and so on and so on.
Shall we wait a couple of minutes more, Fiona? And then...
I think so. Yeah, I don't. Again, remember, I'm unused to Zoom, but I don't see any. I don't see any other attendees currently.
There is one at the moment, so I'd say let's wait a few more minutes.
Yeah,
just 11 now. So.
Thank you to the people who have come on the dot. We'll wait a few minutes. My quick question, my display isn't showing me Q&A, but it's showing me a chat.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. I think people can...
Yeah, but it's. I just want to double check that there is no Q&A.
No, I think you will see the questions in the chat then.
Yeah, that's perfect.
There is Q&A enabled. I can see it here.
Okay.
Then it comes both in the chat and in the...
Yeah.
Okay, I see more people are coming, so let's wait a bit.
Great. And is the recording running?
Yeah,
Great.
Recording and live streaming as well.
Thanks, Chiara. Okay, folks, we'll start in a few minutes, maybe another 1 minute, and then we'll get going because time is tight and there's too much to talk about to delay for much longer. Okay, folks, we'll kick off. You're very welcome to this roundtable on gender, labour and precarity for the celebration of UCC Equality Week. Before we begin, I must note that we are recording this event. So if you'd like to take any steps that you deem necessary to protect your own privacy, please do. And this recording will be available on YouTube. It will also should be available in time in the MA in Women's Studies site in UCC. Another thing I need to say is that we will be cut off without ceremony at high noon at 12 o'clock. So please don't feel that we're throwing people out. This is what the system will do to us. So we'd better get going because we have 2 wonderful books, 2 wonderful authors, and 2 esteemed guests to talk to us about the books and to give us their reactions to the books. So the format that this roundtable will take is that each book will be introduced by our guest. The author will respond for about 5 minutes. We'll have another introduction to a book for about 10 minutes, The author will respond for 5 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and comments. So there's both a chat and a question and answer function. Please do try to put any questions that you have in the Q&A, and you're very welcome to chat away in the chat and make comments. If you'd like to have your comment noted by the panelists, please do put it in the Q&A and just make a note that it's a comment. We will be a little tight for time at the end, but hopefully we'll get to as much of the chat and the comments as possible. So you can see on the screen our esteemed panelists here, and I'll introduce each one as we move from one to the other. You can also see, I hope, the titles of the books. Both books deal with gender, precarity, and labour, and foreground oral testimony in their work. So this is going to be a very exciting morning. Maura Cronin, who's up first, is a historian of 19th century labour and politicisation and of 20th century Irish social life and change. She established the Oral History Archive at Mary Immaculate College, Limerick, in the year 2000. And personally, I must say that Maura is a real pioneer of the oral history context in Ireland, and has been an absolute support to that community down through the years. My apologies, before I hand over to Maura, I'll introduce myself. I'm Cleona O'Carroll. I lecture in the Department of Folklore and Ethnology here in University College Cork, and I also work with the community-based Cork Folklore Project. Maura will be responding to Dr. Liam Cullinan's book, Working in Cork, Everyday Life in Irish Steel, Sunbeam Wolseley and the Ford Marina Plant, 1917 to 2001. Thank you, Maura.
Thanks very much, Cleona. And I'm a bit disconcerted looking at my own mug up on the screen here, because I seem to be looking in a direction that I hadn't really intended, but that's okay. I'm here. I'm here. Thank you for the introduction. I feel like a bit of a historical artifact at this stage, to be honest with you. But when you say 2000, I think, oh my God. Anyway, first of all, two great books, I agree. I've only dipped a bit through Chiara's one, and absolutely wonderful. It makes me see the differences and the similarities between Ireland and the Balkans region. But I suppose my concentration on your book, Liam, it was an honour to read it, and I really am learning from it. And, you know, I'd love to be able to find fault, but I can't. It's great. So I'll make it brief. I'll make it brief, as brief as possible. I'm watching my time. Just for people who are not acquainted with the book, a quick one. It's looking at three different firms in Cork, Ford's, Sunbeam, Irish Steel, all set up at different decades. Ford's in the teens of the 20th century, Sunbeam in the 20s, Irish Steel in the 30s, 40s, really. And they all fade more or less together, 70s, 80s. In a way, ironically, though I'm not even a Cork native, I have a link because my mum-in-law worked in Sunbeam and my dad-in-law and husband worked in Ford. So, you know, I had this kind of third-hand memory and evidence coming to me, and yeah, it's wonderful. It's very enriching. I suppose I've just picked out a few pointers that I thought were particularly valuable in the book, and just say a few words on those. I suppose, firstly, the book deals in two ways. It deals with the position of these firms in the Irish and the local economy on an economic basis, a broader basis. But the part that is most relevant today probably is the working experiences, which is, of course, sewn into your very title, Liam, Working in Cork. And it struck me there that this gels very well with the Balkan study. And I know you used a quote from, oh dear, I can't even pronounce the name, Spaskovska, I think, Chiara. And she talked about oral history where it's not yet entirely past. I thought, oh, that's so good, because that struck me so often doing interviews with people, and it came across very much in Liam's book. It's past, but it's not. And of course, that brings up all of the issues of, you know, I hate the word reliability, because what source is reliable in the end? None. But the reliability of oral history, the backward glance, the retrospective nature, that, by the way, is not a criticism of oral history. It's simply saying it's another exciting kind of filter that we look through. And I think Liam has done a really good job on doing that. in no particular order. I really found it so interesting to look at the paternalism or the absence of paternalism in the different firms. And without going into a lot of detail here, obviously Ford's in their way and Sunbeam in their way were epitomizations of the paternalism or maternalism or whatever the hell you want to call it. What I did like about all of this was that you weren't on a crusade, Liam. You know, I'm sick to the teeth of political crusades which use history as their ladder. And I mean, people are entitled to do it, but it just bugs me, and I'm afraid it's personal. And therefore, you know, there wasn't this implicit critique that paternalism is bad. It's not good, it's not bad, it's of its time. What was it that, what's the wonderful oral historian, the Italian man whose name now has escaped me, but he talked about memory just is and the past just is. Portelli. Yeah, and you know, this is so much what I'm seeing here in this book. And then of course there is the kind of face, the what I would call, or you would call, or we would call, because we live in the whatever century, 21st century, the kind of negative face of paternalism and the control element, which of course is there. You know, whether it be health schemes or social clubs, or the one I loved, and it really has nothing to do with control, but it brought something back to me, was you mentioned a Sunbeam picnic where, you know, staff and workers and management all picnic together happily. And some lady remembered, we even had chicken legs. And, you know, that's such an insight, because chicken legs, cheapest of meat now. In my day, a chicken was a treat. So chicken legs were, you know, the ultimate. So again, those kind of accidental mirrors almost into what thrilled people. And thrilled me, certainly, back in the 50s and 60s, you know, so great. So that control thing I thought you dealt with very well. I don't want to go into it here, but I really would like to say that control is both negative and positive, and you were so impartial in the way that you looked at that. The other thing, of course, which I thought was wonderful, and I'd love more of it, is, you know, this deference thing, where I can't even remember who says what, but deference is simply the other face of contempt, or, you know, the Irish word charus, a bit of sarcasm, and, you know, where tongue-in-cheek stories are told, you know, about Fords or whatever else. And I would have a lot of those 14th hand, because the parent deference that is there until whoever it is goes out the door, and then there's a snigger. It's not nice, it's not kind, but it is the reality of the workplace. And I would have loved more of that if it were possible, but maybe it wasn't to have the place for that in the book, but more in the future, Liam, I think, on that. And humor, you did have a lot on that, humor and jokes as a way of passing the tedium of the job. And of course, I would say as well that humor can be very cruel. Oh my goodness, you know, sending the young fellow out for the long stand, or the bucket of steam, or whatever it is. And there's great stories from Limerick about that as well. Won't go into them here, but it's wonderful, it's lighthearted, it's remembered very positively. It could be very cruel, you know, so again, that double face of what happened. Class, obviously the whole thing here is soaked through with class. And, you know, it's obvious, and I think you're very much aware of that too, Liam, that we're watching class, even though people, you very rightly say, don't even mention the word most of the time. I found that myself in another context, but they've all kinds of other ways of articulating it. But I suppose we have to remember, which indeed you do, that class is viewed from one particular, or through one particular keyhole in this book. It's the workers. It'd be really interesting, wouldn't it, in another time, in another place, to look at it from the management or the office staff or whoever's point of view. And of course, the other thing about class really is, I remember Nana, my mother-in-law, talking about working in Sunbeam. And I don't remember the detail, even though I did interview her and recorded it, thankfully. But you'd know by Nana that, you know, she mightn't be very deferential upwards unless she had to be, but by golly, she knew who was below her, and she would have been working on whatever machines, I now forget. And I don't know who sang the song. Was it Chris Christopherson or somebody said, you know, everybody's got to have somebody to look down on. And in a way, maybe again, we can pursue that. You had it very much with the craft unions, which would be very much a 19th century thing, as that's where I'd really be at home, looking down in their own way at the manual, but you know, the so-called non-skilled workers. That was interesting to me too, that 19th century class-based superiority of the craftsman continues well into the last century now. And you I would have heard it from my husband and my father-in-law as well. They were very conscious, rightly so, that they were very skilled men. But then again, you see, how are they looked upon by those quote unquote below them? I'm sure there were lots of little snide remarks made about craftsmen thinking they were better than they were, etc. And of course, that's one of the other issues, isn't it? Watching my time here, that one needs to be so careful when you're looking at something in a small area. I don't mean Cork is small, but a small local intimate area. It's really very easy to upset people. And in the end of the day, history might matter, but people matter more, I think, anyway. So it's a very tricky one, though, isn't it? That you can easily demonize, or you can say something that you think is funny. I mean, we found that ourselves in Limerick with other things where you think, oh, sugar, I thought that was harmless. I could say you have insulted nobody. You've handled the material so well, Liam. But again, I suppose that in itself, as a historian, you think, oh God, I'd love to have put in such a thing, because it would tell us so much. But again, I'm confined by the ethics, I suppose, of humanity. The other thing I thought there, which was really interesting, was Sunbeam particularly, and you were looking at, was the kind of shifting of solidarity as the end drew nigh, and the women in the plant, in parts of the plant anyway, becoming less supportive of one another and competing for work. And that's what we do, isn't it? We hang on as best we can. So I think you have managed to give this very real picture of solidarity, and at the same time show that it's not something that is without its dangers of being broken. Maybe two other points, important actually, so I better hurry up. Wonderful on locality and kin. Now, anyone who's from Cork or Blackpool, and we lived up towards Dillon's Cross for a while, so kind of sense of Blackpool, and my Nana was from Blackpool, my mother was from Blackpool. So there's that whole emotive thing, which is crazy, really, isn't it? It's so silly, and yet it's wonderfully strong. And I think that came across very, very well in the book. Again, you'd find that with, say, the Limerick bacon factories. Oh my goodness, it was such a strong kin-based, local-based sense of identity, and with its own tyranny, because if you don't belong to that area or that kin group, if times get tough or traumatic, you may be pushed aside, or you may be nice to your face, but maybe they don't think you're the real thing, as it were. And then finally, Liam, and this I suppose what's the word I'm looking for, soaks through, will do everything in the book, the gender thing. And really, again, thank you so much, because you're treating gender as having at least two sides to it. I mean, there's more, but I mean, biological gender, two sides. I am sick to the teeth, I must say, and I am a female, quite obviously, a middle-aged one, certainly, but I'm sick to the teeth of the campaign, the very justified campaign, I should say, by the way, but becoming confused with history. And I think you've managed to be so impartial in that. Now, I don't mean impartial in being wishy-washy, but actually seeing the complications from both sides. Like where I particularly liked this was the whole thing about, maleness and Irish steel, the danger of the job in many ways being a badge that was a real man's job. I'm not saying I necessarily agree with that, but it's a very, very real and understandable, type of belief. I've seen it, in another context myself. And again, what I thought was intriguing there was that, where you were saying that men who were in a clerical job were kind of in a different sphere, and indeed they were. But I wonder too, and again, it may come from the oral histories, whether there isn't an inverted snobbery, because I could imagine some of the people from, my husband's people, who would look down their noses at clerical work on a man's part, because men did physical work. Now, again, I'm not saying that's right, but I think it's another very real reality in looking at the sources. And in fact, I do remember things being said about other sons-in-law, etc., about, Asher couldn't drive a nail. And it was like saying about a woman, sure, she couldn't boil an egg. So the whole gendered language is very much there. But, the men are very much part of, if you like, the scenario as well. And I suppose the last thing there would be that the leaving work on marriage. I'm sure you've met cases, Liam, where women did not, I don't think you have ever said that women at the time thought this was an imposition. I don't think they did. I think it was just, as you say, some did. Now they would, but I'm interested to know what is the proportion of women who actually resent leaving work on marriage and those who, I remember, again, it's only an individual example of somebody saying that she was asked to come back to supervise after marrying. She said, oh gosh, I wasn't going to do that. I was a married woman. You know, and it was fascinating to read the view of her time. Okay, I could go on. I've said my bit. I think it's a really good book. I think it's very, very considered. And I think the very important thing about it is that it's kind to the past. And I think that is so important, particularly when issues of this nature are, you know, engaging us at the present. So thanks for a great book, Liam.
Thanks very much, Maura, for those great comments and for your great timekeeping as well. I'll introduce Liam now to give a response. So Liam Cullinan was awarded his PhD from the School of History, University College Cork in 2016. He's previously been published in Oral History, in Saher, the Journal of Irish of the Labour History Society, and in the Irish Examiner. And thanks very much for joining us today, Liam.
Thanks, Cliona, and thanks, Maura. I hope I can, I'm a little lost for words with the kind words you gave me. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to respond to everything you raised, but certainly in some terms of some of the issues you mentioned, I think that point of not yet entirely past is very important. And it's also because it shapes things from the moment you're gathering the interview sample. It was much, much easier to get Ford and Sunbeam workers than it was to get Irish steel workers. And that reflects really the sort of more general social memory of the workplaces. Ford's has had a coffee table book, events, a play, a DVD produced all about it. Sunbeam had 2 massive successful plays based on it. It's referred to constantly. Then Irish Steel, there's this silence almost around it, even though it was this enormous workplace and was particularly significant for Cove. And I think that comes down to the fact that both the health and safety record of Irish Steel, but also the way it ended with redundancy disputes, with this controversial ownership by ISPAT, and also this sense that you get in Cove that you don't get elsewhere. Chiara's book talks a lot about deindustrialization. It's hard to use that term in relation to Ireland because industry was so scattered in the first place, but there are individual localities where I think you can talk about it, and Cove is one of those. Cove is a place that had a very large manufacturing base for the size of it, and then once that left, it was never really replaced, and that really shone through in the accounts there. But it also had the effect of, because Irish Steel was one of the last workplaces to go, it also had the effect of creating this reluctance to talk about the place, a reluctance to kind of go back over it. So in terms of that issue of the past is not yet entirely past, that runs through everything when you're looking at something like this, you know. The paternalism, I think, is interesting, and I agree. It's more complicated than just being something enforced by management. It's also something that workers can take advantage of if they choose. They can use it if they're providing opportunities, you know, to take advantage of that without eliding the fact that ultimately it is about maintaining a certain power relationship. You know, you have to take each on its circumstances, and paternalism in one place, you know, paternalism means a very different thing for Harlan County than it does for Cork, and you have to kind of examine each one individually. Going back to paternalism, I think it was interesting that in Ireland, and certainly in Sunbeam, you have the emergence of paternalism really in the aftermath of the Second World War. And in Chiara's book as well, she talked about a sort of more Yugoslav socialist factory paternalism that seems to be happening around the same period. I think there's more to be done on why, even with a very different ideological background, that there does seem to be this growth in factory paternalism, this sort of concern with it in the aftermath of the Second World War, even in very different locations with very different with very different situations and very different motivations and relationships going on. In terms of the gender aspect, I mean, I think I focused on the male side of that gender and labor thing a lot, partially because that women's history in Ireland has been very successful at using oral history. There's been ground broken already. People like Mary Muldowney, Liz Kiley and Maura Leanne in UCC. There's been a lot of really good oral history work done by feminist and women's historians in Ireland, because in a lot of cases, you had so little to go on. Oral history is the obvious route to go down to find these stories. So to an extent, what I'm doing in the book is just adding to that, since I kind of wanted to have two mostly male factories and then a female factory, to extent to balance that out. In the sense it's been a victim of its own success in a way. But certainly, I would say you can't really understand how gender operates historically. It's a binary idea. It's that you've two columns, male, female, and the ideas, the ideology of what each is supposed to do or supposed to be. I think you do have to kind of look at them against each other, and when you do that, it does create you do get very rich results out of it. As to the inverted snobbery kind of idea, that I certainly did come across that thing of manual workers looking down on white collar workers. There was one Irish steel worker I spoke to, Christie, who I asked him, he was a very old man at this stage, and I asked him, well, what was it like working Irish steel? And he said, well, you wouldn't have lasted there anyway. But I'm not sure that's a sort of snobby, because for a start, there's a very real sense that those white collar workers, certainly in the male case, they were higher than them on the hierarchy. They had better jobs, better conditions, higher status. I think that idea of that sort of pride in risk-taking, pride in the physicality of work, it's different. I don't think you can see it in the same way as those other status divisions, because it's really more about individual pride and individual self-description than kind of playing into an existing status hierarchy, As to the craft unions, I'd be interesting. Yeah, it was quite interesting. And certainly the divisions between the craft workers and the general operatives in all the factories, There's a great book it was a book you recommended actually, Maura, on the pork butchering trade in Limerick. And there's an excellent line, what's the difference between the Pope and a pork butcher? A pork butcher can become Pope, but the Pope can never become a pork butcher, And it's interesting how much more significant that is in Ireland. I think potentially it can be explained by the fact that Ireland remains so underdeveloped that there's an onus on those older craft traditions and that sort of guildish way of organizing, of keeping people out. It's a reflective of the fact that you've got constant immigration, you've got this large pool of unemployed people at various points constantly growing. Therefore, there's much more onus on craft workers to keep up those kind of guild type ways of operating. But what I did find, and I've confirmed this with sort of sociological research at the time, even though there is a certain amount there's a certain status there, the craft workers do generally try to keep their differentials and their status there. In general, it was downplayed by both general operatives and craft workers in the narratives. It was never, whenever it was brought up, they'd always emphasize that the more important one was that white collar, blue collar distinction, not, even though there was significant differences in wages, significant difference in conditions, it does seem to be the case that they came from the same communities, lived in the same kind of houses. They were aware of it. It could be expressed very dramatically, like the 6-month strike in Irish Steel, where the craft workers go out, but not the general operatives. But even so, and it's confirmed by contemporary sociological investigations, the big division is the white collar, blue collar one within the factory. So I'm just checking there that I'm not taking up too much time. How am I for that, Kalina?
If you want to take 1 minute now to wind it up.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, I suppose certainly since this is discussing, I really enjoyed Cleana's book actually. I think maybe the things I'd like to kind of emerge in the discussion, one thing was we mentioned sort of the construction of the Irish woman, of what they're supposed to look like, and there's been a lot done on that on gender ideology. I suppose looking at the Irish views of that, of the ideal woman worker, or in general, according to the ideology, the ideal woman wasn't a worker, but the versus the similar constructions in Yugoslavia, the idea of the working mother, the self-sacrificing labor that Chiara looks at in her book. And also, I think the different ideological backdrops and how that plays out in the factory floor. So on the one hand, Irish Catholicism, and on the other, Yugoslav socialism. Chiara's book talks a lot about the ideology, the ideas that underline the experiences. I think maybe it might be interesting to bring out a little bit how those two distinct sort of ideologies play out in everyday life, in people's thoughts, in people's actions on a very day-to-day level. So I probably haven't responded to everything, but that'll have to do you. Okay.
That's great. Thanks so much, Liam. And I'll just remind you that Liam's book came out from Cork University Press in 2020. Hopefully, we might have a few minutes at the end for the two authors to respond explicitly to each other's work, because I bet they have an awful lot to talk about. So you can keep that in mind. Okay, so now we're going to move on to Chiara Bonfiglioli's work, which is Women and Industry in the Balkans, the Rise and Fall of the Yugoslav Textile Sector, that came out with Bloomsbury in 2019. And the paperback has just come out, which will be great news for us all. So Rory Archer is going to respond to the book, and he's a social historian who works primarily in the history of labour, gender and migration in 20th century Southeast Europe at the University of Graz, Austria, and Universität Konstanz in Germany. Thanks so much for joining us today, Rory.
Thank you very much, Cliona, for the introduction, and to Chiara as well. It's a real pleasure to join you today. I'm, unlike Maura, I actually am a native of Cork City, so it's also very nice to be here. It's my first time participating at an event in UCC, and of course I would much prefer to do so in person, but I hope there'll be some opportunity to do so in the not so distant future. Congratulations, Chiara, on the paperback coming out. I've had the pleasure of seeing this book develop over the last couple of years, seeing it sort of take shape through different collaborations at events, conferences, and so on. And it's really nice now to see it in paperback. So I'm conscious of the time going by quite quickly, so I'll try to kind of shrink down what I wanted to say, because I would also like to hear Chiara's response, and maybe to have a little bit of a discussion with between herself and Liam as well, because I think there's quite a few things, common threads running through the books. So Chiara's study is it's a very ambitious study. It does quite a few things simultaneously, and it's engaged with a number of debates and bodies of literature. So first and foremost, it's a feminist labour history of Yugoslavia from the post-World War II era right up nearly until the present day. It's a history of the garment industry as a sector. It's a comparative factory history, and it does this through oral history, factory documents and periodicals. And it shows then in Yugoslavia how factories and the garment sector more broadly attempted to socialize and to modernize generations of Yugoslav women. And this is one of the ways that authorities were able to intervene and to sort of recast society, sometimes in problematic and even coercive ways. But it's also clear from the study that women were not simply recipients in this process; they were also active agents in the process in the project of socialist modernity, despite sometimes this agency being constrained as well. So the book, as well as a kind of a textile, multi-factory and social history, it also interrogates the subjectivity and the agency of working class women, as well as the intersection of class and gender in conditions of real existing socialism. So it's a diachronic account of the development of a Fordist-like creation of working class communities in state socialist conditions, and then the subsequent unmaking of these communities in the post-socialist era of deindustrialization. So we can see the kind of a social history of typical life trajectories of this kind of ascendancy of Yugoslav socialism at its pinnacle, its demise, and then the post-socialist afterlife. And so the book sort of transverses these socialist era and post-socialist ruptures. And this is notable because most studies of Yugoslav space or post-socialist space generally tend to look at either one side of the rupture, of the 1989 or 1991 rupture, instead of accounting for kind of longer-term transformations which are included in this book. And so I'd like to just read, I think, a very small passage from the book's introduction. I think it can kind of convey the importance of the Yugoslav garment industry as an entry point into a range of different phenomena this study engages with. So the industry covered over 10% of manufacturing in the 1970s and 1980s, exporting its garments and textiles worldwide. New factories appeared in the main cities and peripheral towns of the Federation, mainly employing young rural women for whom factory work became a way to achieve economic independence and a host of welfare rights such as healthcare, cheap housing, and subsidized holidays. The Marxist idea of workers' councils was combined in original ways with the Fordist vision of work, determining individual workers' wages according to their productivity, but also allowing for general redistributive welfare mechanisms within factories, especially when it came to working mothers, who represented the majority of the workforce in textiles. In contrast, the closure of many textile and garment factories in the 1990s and 2000s as a result of the collapse of socialism and the Yugoslav wars, with the subsequent loss of 350,000 jobs, as well as the precarization of labor in the industry due to global competition, fundamentally altered workers' Fordist imaginary shaped during the socialist era. So Chiara then employs the structure of feeling as developed by cultural theorist Raymond Williams, and this is used to kind of to discuss how ways of life shaped by industrialization were then challenged by processes of deindustrialization, factory closure. And so Williams used the term to investigate a particular quality of social experience and relationship historically distinct from other particular qualities, which gives a sense of a generation or a period. I think this is really productive in the book in accounting for the ambivalence felt by women regarding aspects of their working lives, as well as nostalgia. So to account for the sort of interplay of both. And it's grounded in the everyday, in the rigid and the habitual, and the mundane details of the ordinary life, and in the gray zone of semi-official practices. And so it can account for the experience of this sort of official or normative framing of the socialist workplace, but also the ways in which individual Yugoslav workers negotiated and navigated the system informally. So it kind of sort of highlight both affect and social memory or collective memory. And I think for me, one of the most, someone who's working in Yugoslav history, what I really like about the book is that it sort of sets itself up to deparochialize Yugoslav social history, in that it brings the case into dialogue with broader debates on industrialization, on post-socialism, precarious conditions and situations in capitalist peripheries, as well as of course, as state socialism, post-socialism concepts. So I think there's maybe a bit of a tendency for historians of Yugoslavia to overemphasize the specificities of the state because of its non-aligned political orientation during socialism. So it wasn't part of the Moscow bloc. Then workers' self-management, which is quite unique. And then, of course, the bloody nature of its collapse in the early 1990s. And I think the violent nature of this collapse has stunted attempts to include Yugoslavia in studies of post-socialism. And arguably, it's almost erased a lot of the knowledge that had been created in labor history in the decades prior to the wars of the 1990s. And now I think in the last decade or so, there's a tendency to revisit or to maybe rediscover Yugoslav social science and some of the research paradigms which have been dominant between the 1960s and the late 1980s. And I think Chiara's work is certainly in this vein. Well, she's in close contact with social historians and anthropologists of Central and Eastern Europe, and then links her own cases within Yugoslavia to David Kadekel's Romania or Alison Stenning's Poland, and scholarship from Yugoslav area studies too. But it's not restricted to this state socialist contexts. Chiara also links this to deindustrialization and post-socialism as much wider conditions. And so he draws upon Jackie Clark's work in France and David Byrne in the northwest of England, now kind of in this setting with Liam's book on working in Cork. And I think certainly what the books have in common is this longue durée focus over the 20th century, these mixed methods of oral history and different sort of sources from factory archives, and of course this the concern with everyday life as an important category. And so I had quite a few questions, but I think I'll whittle them down to just a couple of points that Chiara may want to respond to or not. And so the first is regarding precarity. So as a concept, I mean, it's often associated with, let's say, kind of late capitalist Western Europe and North America. So is there maybe some sort of Balkan precarity or post-socialist precarity, something specific, and can this help add to scholarly debates about it? And then to follow that up regards sort of maybe feelings of precarity during socialism itself, because I think we can agree that there's a lot of limitations and deficiencies in practice in Yugoslav socialism that workers encountered, but does maybe sort of the horror of both kind of the wars of the 1990s and then this economic transformations that occurred at the same time, does that make it sometimes more difficult to approach deficiencies? Because it's very, very difficult recent past kind of preventing us from accessing, particularly in oral history, discussions of maybe other things which were problematic. And then the last is just regarding the kind of maybe the state of the art with gender history and sort of women's history in Yugoslavia and beyond. I mean, I find the working mother gender contract is very interesting, but I also read it as kind of indicative of maybe slightly conservative nature of Yugoslav society, and this there's this sort of expectation that everyone is part of a nuclear family, and this is very much the dominant model. And I know in the book at some points you do look at cases such as unmarried single mothers, women who chose not to get married and who were single. I was wondering kind of other how women who were not working mothers or sort of typical working mothers kind of fitted into the system. And I think I can stop here and hand over to Chiara when she's ready.
That's wonderful. Thanks a million, Rory. You've contextualized Chiara's work so succinctly and brought up so many interesting questions, but I'm very grateful to you for really opening things up for me, certainly, on that. So finally, we have Chiara in response. Chiara Bonfiolini, now I've lost it. Bonfiolini, wrong, but anyway, is a lecturer in gender and women's studies at University College Cork here in Ireland. Her research addresses transnational women's and feminist history with a specific focus on the former Yugoslavia and Italy. And I'd like to thank Chiara for bringing us together. Chiara's work is the impetus for us all coming together, and she's put a lot of work into coordinating us. And I'd also at this point like to thank the EDI unit, our colleagues there, who have hosted this, this event technologically and also provided impetus for it. Take it away there, Chiara.
Thank you so much, Fiona, and thank you to Anne-Marie indeed for hosting this event as part of Equality Week. It's great to have this conversation with you today. I will just give a kind of very short background to the research. So this started when I was doing my postdoc at the University of Edinburgh within the project named CITSI, which was about citizenship in Southeast Europe. And I started looking at the issue of gender and class as a result of recent protests by garment workers and textile workers in the region in the 2000s and 2010s. And when I started doing some field work there, what was very striking was indeed this feeling of perduring attachment to the workplace, even though many of these factories had closed already for several years or were in the process of bankruptcy. And there was this whole attachment to the past, and now these factories in the past used to be successful. And people kept telling me, my parents were so happy going to work, and it was so different. And something that came up also in Liam's book that I found really striking when he was talking about the Sunbeam, this concept of we had everything in the factory. We had the health clinic, we had the dentist, we had a great canteen, restaurant, we had the subsidized holidays to the seaside. So there was really this sense of the factory as a socialist microcosm and as a social microcosm as well, but with this additional socialist ideology that we were talking about, this idea, you know, that the workers are getting something back in exchange of their hard work. And was this socialist or was this Fordist? That's something we can keep for the discussion. You know, I found very many similarities with Liam's book. And I think sometimes Yugoslavia is being treated as an exceptional case, while in fact it was very much in dialogue with you know, other contexts, especially in this kind of 30 glorious or 30 glorious decades of Fordism after World War II, as it is called in France. So when it comes to, so indeed, when I was starting to talk to people, then I really had the sense of, you know, it's important to look at this phenomenon of the textile industry, especially in the longue durée, because there has been a kind of a structural feeling created through the beginnings of Yugoslav socialism, especially at the beginning when these factories were starting after World War II. They were extremely, let's say, poor factories. They didn't have much, and then there was a sense that the factory over the years managed to raise itself thanks to the work and sacrifice of its employees, and that kind of created this sense of attachment as well for the workers. You know, this idea of having contributed to the success of the factory, and a certain pride as well of having invested so much time and effort in something that became so successful in the 70s and 80s, when the garment industry in Yugoslavia was extremely successful and exporting not just to Western Europe, but also to Eastern Europe and other countries in the global South. So to reply to some of the questions that Rory posed, well, there is this idea, you know, and indeed there is a bit of a difficulty there when dealing with oral history in the region, because the transition in the former Yugoslavia has been so brutal and so fast when we compare it to other places in Western Europe, that people tend to be glossing over the issues that were there when you know, before 1989, because the situation became so bad in comparison afterwards that everything beforehand seemed very normal and better, you know. So on the one hand, it's a bit of a challenge how to account for this extreme precarity and extreme exploitation that's going on right now in the garment sector in post-Yugoslav states, in places like Macedonia or Serbia. And the fact that even before 1989, things were not perfect. And even before then, you know, there were class and gender hierarchies in the sector, and especially blue-collar workers were feeling quite at the bottom of the hierarchies. You know, I in the oral history interview, they kept telling me like, yeah, you know, the textile industry was always low paid and we were always at the bottom. And that's how we were raised. We didn't know better. And it was often women who were not highly educated, were coming from rural background, poor families, who will end up in the industry, and kind of they would still feel this difference with white collar workers and the management, especially when it came to political participation and trade unionism. They really tried to stay out of politics and mind their own families and basically survive their everyday life, especially if we think that work was so strenuous in these factories, and many of them they were doing the night shift and then coming home and taking care of domestic work and childcare. So it was really this working mother gender contract was not perfect. I mean, the idea was that the state would socialize childcare and other domestic tasks for women to be able to join the labor force. And in that sense, the Yugoslav constitution very much differed from the Irish one, in the sense that it was not about, you know, making sure that women do not have out to go to work. It was about making sure that women who want to go to work are kind of supported by the state to do so. But even then, there was a similar expectation for women to be taking care of the house and be the main caretakers in the house. So it became very strenuous for many of them to be able to do so. And so there were indeed certain feelings of precarity also before 1999 in a number of interviews. But still, the greatest exploitation and the greatest feeling of, you know, not being able to combine productive and reproductive work came afterwards, especially in this new generation who was bearing the brunt of what has been called for the region the criminal privatization process. So this privatization that was really ruthless and didn't at all, you know, take care of the well-being of workers, and was characterized by bankruptcies, but also unpaid wages. Many of these women went through months of unpaid wages when they didn't know how to feed their families, and very harsh conditions there. And I think, I was trying to balance this account of the socialist era, which has been seen quite nostalgically for good reasons, with the most recent exploitation and criminal privatization of the industry. And by doing that, I was also trying to engage with gender history and gender debates, and especially on this idea, that there was no agency under state socialism for women, which has been often repeated and reinstated due to the fact that women were subjected to this awful double burden. What I was trying to show is that even then, even when women were, awfully submitted to this double burden of productive and reproductive work, there were instances of agency through the fact that they could earn their own salary. They had all these different welfare arrangements that were sort of supporting them. And when it comes to women who didn't fit the traditional gender model, that's something very specific, because many of these factories were seen as kind of social buffers and social places where women, like single mothers or women were coming out widows, women weren't having stable situation when it came to family life, could count on the factory for support and for certain welfare arrangements that will help them to get by. So there was definitely this idea that some of these factories were like social buffers, and I explicitly talked to one of these white-collar secretaries in one of the factories in Pula in Croatia, and she was like, I had to force single mothers and these poorest women to go on holiday. So I was really telling them, you need to go on holiday, you need to take a break, and they didn't want to go, and they didn't think they could go. They thought this is not for us, but she was trying really. So there was this sort of paternalism or maternalism, especially towards the most downtrodden workers and the workers who were the most, let's say, at the lowest level of the social scale. And in that sense, these factories did an important work in terms of modernization of gender relations and also in creating some certain kind of sociability there across. And I think that's something that came up in Liam's book as well, this idea of sociability. And one worker would say, it was better when I would go to work, because at least I would have this kind of social connections with others. We were working hard, and it was hard work, but still we were singing, and we were having this social connection. And I think that really created a sort of sense of belonging at that time, and a certain specific structure of feeling. I don't want to take more time. I think I talked already much. So I'll leave it to this. And thank you so much for your comments. And I hope I replied to some of the questions.
Thanks so much, Chiara. We've got a few minutes now for discussion and questions. I don't see any questions in the Q&A box or in the chat. So if you do have a question, please do raise your hand. But this is a good opportunity as well for the two authors to talk to each other. I have something that if we have time, you might address, which is this idea of ambivalence that's coming up a lot, and the idea of writing ambivalence and communicating ambivalence in an academic context or in any dissemination context, and the thoughts that you have on that, and particularly in terms of comparative work as well. However, we'll put that to one side. And the first thing that I wanted to just ask the two authors to do, and our esteemed guests can also chip in, is perhaps just to say a few words on what resonated most with you or surprised you in the others' work, the kinds of things that you got excited about. So Liam's already said a few words. We might start with Chiara and then go on to Liam.
Right. So yeah, I read mostly the whole book, and I was struck by a number of of things like this attachment to the place, and what you were this difference also between Cork and Cov, and the fact that the Irish still was not talked about at all, and that there you had a specific case of deindustrialization, while in other cases like that it had less resonance in popular culture. That's what you said, right, about Cov and the Irish Steel. And then that these other companies, instead Ford and Sunbeam, were much more resonating with popular culture and seen with more nostalgia for being better place of work, that I found very interesting, like the different kind of emotional aspect attached to the different factories. And what in terms of gender, I found very interesting that women were given their salary to their mother. That I found extremely interesting, this idea that, you know, the mother of in the family was managing the salaries of the daughters while they were waiting to get married, and then when they will be married they will normally abandon work, and so this idea that female workers' career in the industry was kind of fragmented and not lasting for decades like the male career, that I found very interesting, because in my case the workers were staying in the factory for 20, 30 years, and sometimes from beginning of their work around 15 years old to retirement. So that I found very, very striking. So I was wondering, you know, if you can come back to that, maybe, yeah, to what extent this few years of work in such factories were enough to create a certain connection or a certain sociability. So how many years on average would they stay in these factories? Did that be something like around 10 years before they got married, or was it less? Would they come back sometimes? And you said in the 70s and 80s they started to come back. So that was something I found striking. Yeah. I'm not sure if anyone wants to respond.
I do. So yeah, and again, I think what struck me again reading your book was that came up. You did mention, in fact, it's one of the first lengthy quotes that comes up is a young worker, well, describing in her youth how she started working, came home and gave the wage packet to her mother. Like, it was interesting, again, the different country where that remains norm. Woman, mother is the household manager. When you're young, you're contributing to the household, that kind of idea. I suppose it kind of gears into how young, the fact that all these ideas are inculcated in from childhood in the family, like that division of labor. I mean, so certainly in the case of, I spoke to one guy who he was the only son in a family of 6 or 7. All the others were girls. The others handed their wage packets to the mother. He didn't, because the idea was he would be going out on his own, being head of a household, being a breadwinner, and there was training towards that. It was inculcating these ideas at a very young age. So as in regards to your question, the norm up until the 60s and 70s does seem to have been, you'd start working very young, maybe 14, 15, 16, some cases younger, and you were married, assuming you did get married. Obviously, some people didn't, and some people emigrated, and that kind of creates a little bit of an issue there. But usually early 20s, people got married. You'd withdraw from work either on marriage or birth of the first child. And what's striking maybe in the Irish context, where you had such a different ideological background, is that was just utterly seen as the norm. And this comes back, I think, to precarity, because Maura is correct. Like, the consensus, I think, had in Irish women's labour history, sort of after the Second World War and just before it as well, that was by and large not questioned. It wasn't really until the 60s and 70s that did start being questioned. In Ireland, it was actually quite a bit later than in most other places. It was just so utterly taken the norm. Most people didn't feel of it as an imposition, because it was beyond their horizon of expectations to step back and say, what if I could do something else, you know? So it's interesting then, because how does precarity sort of come into that then? Because if you asked a young woman worker in the 50s or 60s, are you in a precarious short-term working arrangement? They probably would have said no, because if you were in the sunbeam and you lasted from when you were 15 or 16 until you got married, that was a job for life. Like, again, the thought by and large didn't enter that maybe I could continue working, or maybe I could do this or do this. It was just so utterly taken for granted that the marriage would be abandoned, that the job would be abandoned for the sake of the marriage.
Liam, I'm just going to jump in now
Sure.
because just because we're in the final minutes, perhaps, and I'll thank everybody just in case we do get cut off, and then we can continue the chat. So I'd particularly like to thank the Equality and Diversity and Inclusion Unit for providing the platform for this, and to all of our panelists for this great morning of chat. We'll continue and hope for the best.
Okay, I'm so sorry. Again, it was just a different industrial context, because again, your descriptions of the sort of post-socialist landscape of just workers not being paid for 9 months, being previously lionized in the official kind of propaganda of the state to being seen as just extremely low status. And what this comes to is how that connects with solidarity, because it was mentioned that like it was mentioned in my book, regarding my book, the examples of solidarity, and Maura mentioned as well that it sort of faded in the 80s, where you had a very, very like awkward position for workers, where the jobs were going, they were fighting over work. And it seems to me, and you could maybe comment on this, that solidarity tends to happen when there's a material basis to it, when, you know, there's either when there's a material basis to it, when the economy is such a way that workers can exercise that control, that unity can have an issue, or in desperation, like when there's a factory closure and it's likely that there'll be very little to be able to be done about it, but people do sort of rally together. And I think particularly I'd be interested in the case of in the Yugoslav example, how that plays out. Is it the case that solidarity manifests either in times of desperation, or in times when there's just a very strong material basis to allow for that solidarity?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I think that kind of harks back to the question of the trade unions, which you cover so well in your book. I mean, in my book, I didn't deal that much with trade unions, also because in the textile industry, the trade union was particularly weak, especially in this last 30 years. They've been weakened out very much with all this whole privatization process. The thing to remember is that during Yugoslav socialism, the trade unions were kind of on the side of the state. I mean, there were conflicts and contestations there as well, and strikes and whatnot. But generally, they were seen as on the side of the state, managing these welfare arrangements, such as the subsidized holidays or the canteens and so on. And so the whole I mean, that's the point that has been made by a number of authors, that workers weren't really, because of this paternalism and because of the trade unions being so allied with the state and connected with the management, workers weren't that trained to exercise their rights or to fight for their rights. They kind of expected those welfare arrangements and rights, but they weren't, able to take up how to say, contestation. And that was especially the case for women, because women tended to be to participate less in these trade unions and to be less involved with workers' councils and management, like managing this. So they were less, involved in this self-management ideology of the Yugoslav state, which was based on the Workers' Council, and I think that's something that kind of impacted on the industry afterwards as well. But in terms of solidarity, I mean, the most solidarity is being remembered definitely for the good times, like when people were able to rely on a number of arrangements, and they knew that they could count on the factory, and they could count on their co-workers if they were falling on bad times. And the post-socialist period is seen as period of when there was more competition, more tension, when people were not being paid, there was bankruptcy, there were all these rumors, not knowing what was happening. I think that unpredictability was something that was very strong in the post-socialist period, this feeling of unpredictability and of security and safety related to the job and to what goes with the job, and then this feeling like anything can happen, and people starting to be competing with each other, and also struggling to survive, and not really having time for this nice associational and leisure activities that you also mentioned in your book. This, that was something that has been mentioned by social historians and scholars of the post-Yugoslav region, this idea that the sociability networks are kind of hollowing out and emptying out with the winning of the trade unions and the winning of the this cultural associations that were associated to family to factory life, and that workers could make use of. Rory, you might want to say something a bit more on that, maybe about this, already of solidarity and sociability. I know you've been working more on this 1980s, 1990s period of transition and crisis in Yugoslavia before the changes. So you might want to say something on that.
Yeah, just, I mean, looking back at a lot of the sources, when one looks at Yugoslavia in the 1980s, it was a kind of a crisis-ridden decade. And so if we look at things published in at the level of factory sources of factories or periodicals produced by and for workers, or even tabloid media from the second half of the 1980s, they portrayed the 80s as already kind of as a time of transition, of deep crisis, and as kind of the opening for that, which is why I posed the question to Chiara about how to kind of recover some of those ambivalences as well, particularly from the last decade.
I wonder at this point, Maura, I saw you taking notes. Do you have a few comments to make?
Well, I'll tell you more a question than a comment. And I'm kind of on a tangent here, really, because when we're talking about, hierarchy and all of that, I was wondering, and it's probably more a question for Liam. I think, Chiara, with your concentration on women, it may not be a question. Anyway, whatever it is. Was there a sense in which sport, whether it be a football club or, bowling or whatever it was, could bridge that social divide between, maybe not management, but certainly between the white collar people and the yard or whatever. I'm thinking of, the Ranks Mills, where it seemed temporarily to bridge that divide because they played soccer or, it was Limerick, rugby together. And I'm just wondering if there's any, or is there anything similar in the Yugoslav case, Chiara, even if it may not be the same thing, the temporary bridges?
The thing you mentioned about the chicken wings and that party at Sunbeam, that really reminded me of some of the parties that were done in socialist Yugoslavia, especially this New Year's Eve party and 1st of May. So there was once a worker who said on the 1st of May we would dress up like real ladies, like Jovanka, the first lady, and then it would be like this moment when everybody's hanging out with each other, and there was no difference between the director and the workers. We were all partying together, and so there was definitely this kind of moment of and definitely, but in terms of sport, I wouldn't say that would bridge so much the gap between white and blue collar. I mean, I'm not an expert on that again, but in terms of for instance, the firefighter association was very prominent in Yugoslavia. So women were taking up this firefighting clubs, and then they were going for excursions with the firefighter association. So that was something that the different cities, and they would have exchanges with the different cities and the different republics. So that was something interesting there in terms of association.
So with sport, it's hard to say. It didn't form a big enough part of my research for me to say it. There certainly were different clubs and sporting activities where white collar and blue collar would have been involved together. I suppose, actually what Chiara mentioned there got me thinking about, certainly in Sunbeam, there were very similar events. These kermesse events held by William Dwyer, which were held on the Sunbeam grounds around the swimming pool. He used to have a party trick where he'd get up in his swimming togs and a big top hat and dive into the pool. But that was an event where the workers, middle classes, the Dwyer family did commingle. They were together. They would have had, there would have been live opera, live music being played, and again did create this sort of temporarily bridging the gaps. Though very much in a, I would say, conscious paternalist way of, it was very much directed by Dwyer, whereas most of the sports clubs, associational culture in general were bottom up, you know. So yeah, I think that is an interesting comparison. But in general, it's really hard to say from the sports, on the sports side of things. I'll leave that to sports historians to maybe look into a little bit deeper, you know.
Thanks.
Okay, folks. Well, perhaps on that upbeat note, the idea of bridging gaps, even though we know that there are many gaps that cannot be bridged and many situations that can't be easily explored or communicated. I'd just like to thank everybody. We'll finish up now. I'd like to thank our remaining audience members for sticking with us, and all of the panelists, and congratulations to both of the authors on these two wonderful books.
Thank you so much, Cleona, for moderating and sharing in a great way. Thank you.
Cleona.
Thanks,
Take
everybody.
care, folks.
Thanks very